All right, welcome to the first homework video of the Unit 5 Agriculture Unit in AP Human Geography. What we're going to be looking at is commercial versus subsistence agriculture. Now, what we have examined so far is where agriculture comes from, these ideas of revolutions with agriculture. We have seen the diffusion of agriculture and what it's done in the world. But now we're finally going to get into the nitty-gritty of this unit and really start analyzing different types of agricultures, where they are in the world, and how they affect the development of those countries. But first, we have to be able to differentiate between different types of agriculture. And the most basic type of differentiation is commercial versus subsistence agriculture. So that's what we're going to explore. Now in your notebooks, you should definitely make this chart of commercial versus subsistence, because what we're going to look at is the purpose of these types of agricultures, the number of farmers for these types of agricultures, the machinery involved with these two types, and farm size. At the end of the day, we're going to learn a bunch of different types of agriculture. But when it all comes down to it, you can always come back to these two types of agriculture, this way of differentiating types of agriculture. So first we start with the purpose. Commercial farmers work to feed everybody. Commercial farmers, their main purpose is to grow their crop to then sell it to make sure it gets processed and into the grocery stores where we can buy it. Whereas in the developing world, subsistence farmers work to feed themselves. They can't go to the Publix down the street and buy whatever they want to buy. They have to harvest what they grow, and they have to work every day at it to not starve. Now, when we talk about numbers of farmers, and this touches back a little bit on the second agricultural revolution. In the developing world, in LDCs, we know that there's not money there to go to the supermarket, that everybody works on the farm to make sure that everybody eats. And we know that in this traditional way of living, that people are going to have more kids because kids are free labor. Now, everybody is involved in farming. Everybody in that community, whether it be parents, kids, everybody has farms. Everybody's farming. It's the number one job in the world. Whereas in the developed world, when we went through the second stage of the demographic transition, we had this massive migration into cities where people got jobs in urban areas. And in the countryside, you had huge amounts of land now that were available for farming and the introduction of machines. So now we only have a small amount of farmers in the rural countryside in the developed world who are providing food for everybody else. Now, as I mentioned, the most people, we know that of the 8 billion people on the planet, 7 billion of them are in the developing world. And if we say most people in the developing world are farmers because they're living on subsistence agriculture, that means that farming is the most common job in the world, where about 50% of all people in the world are farmers today, doing the basic necessities to gather food to live. Now, I touched on this a little bit when I was talking about number of farmers. Now we talk about machinery. So subsistence agriculture is already involving a lot of people because they don't have money to buy machinery and stuff like that. But what we call this is labor-intensive agriculture, because that's what's required to harvest and grow food is labor in the developing world. They're using hand tools, animal power. Whereas in the developed world, where they have these acres and acres and acres of land growing one crop, commercial farmers buy equipment to help them do that. And you can see some of this equipment in the picture. We would categorize agriculture that uses money and uses machines, commercial agriculture, as capital intensive, because capital is money, right? And it takes a lot of money to be a commercial farmer because you got to buy a lot of machinery. So this is why commercial agriculture is so effective when such a small amount of our population is actually performing the farming. But when these $1 million tools can do, or these $1 million machines can do the jobs of hundreds of subsistence farmers in hand tools. So when we think about agricultural density, we can ask ourselves, what is the relationship between an area's agricultural density and the type of farming? If you have a low agricultural density, you probably have a capital intensive, not a lot of people working, type of agriculture. But if you have a very high agricultural density, where a large amount of your people are performing that job, it's probably labor intensive. And in the subsistence agriculture world, we looked at this all the way back in Unit 1 when we were looking at densities and analyzing different densities. Now we're just adding more to this knowledge later in the course. Finally, we have size of farms. Now, the size of farms, and I've touched on this too, in the developing world, because it's people and hand power, labor intensive with, hand tools and animals, their farms are generally small because remember, they're just feeding themselves or their local community. Whereas in commercial farms, they're very, very large. But remember, that comes from a time where everybody left the rural area and went into the urban areas. So now you have all of this land, and all of this land has to feed all these people. So farmers take all of this land and they they don't take it, they buy all this land and they use the big machines to then provide food for everybody. So this is what it should look like. This is a very quick and just simple version of this chart. But remember, in respect to commercial versus subsistence, the purpose of commercial farming is to farm things to sell, versus subsistence, it's to farm to survive and eat. The number of farmers in the commercial world is less than 5%, where in the developing world, it's a majority of residents. Machinery is heavily relied on in commercial agriculture. It is the thing that makes it go. Where in subsistence agriculture, there's very little reliance on technology. And finally, with farm size in the commercial world, they're very large, and that's why we have the technology. Whereas in subsistence agriculture, they're fairly small. So now we have and this touches on the size of the farms, the proper vocab way of thinking about it, and a way that we will separate types of agriculture too. So aside from commercial versus subsistence, or capital intensive versus labor intensive, we have the difference in size, intensive versus extensive agriculture. Extensive agriculture is what takes up huge amounts of land. Think expansive, but huge amounts of land, what we've seen in commercial agriculture. And intensive agriculture does not use a lot of room. Now, I know this seems confusing or it seems redundant, but it is just vocab that they generally use. So commercial agriculture is capital intensive. It's extensive in its land size, while subsistence agriculture is generally labor intensive and intensive with its land size, right? That's me just practicing using these words. Now, farmers will alter the environment to produce more food from smaller spaces, and we're going to explore this idea, but what vocab word is it? And right away, what should be popping into your head is environmental possibilism. So when we talk about intensive farming, now in intensive farming, because they don't have the luxury of all of this land, they have to, in intensive farming situations, have to alter the land to increase the area. And what you're seeing here is one example of possibilism. It's called terracing, where they literally cut into a sloped mountain to create more flat land to increase the amount of land available for agriculture. And they literally do this with hand tools, as you can see in the picture. All right, so what do you need to know today? First off, understand the differences between subsistence and commercial farming. Then make sure you can explain what these different types of agriculture look like. What does commercial look like? What does subsistence look like? What does capital intensive look like? What does labor intensive look like? Know where these different types of agricultures are located in the world. Commercial is generally located in the developing, while subsistence is generally in the developing world. And then finally, understand the difference between extensive agriculture and intensive agriculture. We're going to use these words, extensive and intensive agriculture, a little bit more when we examine some other types of agricultures, and we'll be able to apply these ideas to those. That's it for the day. If you had any questions on this homework assignment, make sure that you write it down in your notebook or highlight it so you can bring it up in class. If you have any questions, you can send me a message on Canvas.